All right, so this morning what I wanted to do, for those who were at the workshop and also if you weren't, just to go over some basic highlights. You know, I gave quite a number of presentations during the workshop and even prior to that, and so what I've done is just kind of pull together the really, really key points just as a reminder. And then, you know, I would encourage everyone who wants to kind of take a deeper dive to go back to the original presentations and kind of really take a look at those. But I just wanted to make sure that we covered the basic ground, and then, like Nicole said, we can, you know, to have questions and discussion, and then sort of practice around the 60-second sound bites. So basically what we covered in the workshop was sort of how key components of crafting a policy message, and then we talked a lot about writing for a policy audience. So if you recall on this slide, we talk about your goal, audiences, and we're going to get into the details on these, you know, coming up with your objectives, messages, the formats you'll use, pre-testing, implementation, and evaluation. So actually, on second thought, we're not going into detail on all of these things. We're actually just going to focus in on goals, audiences, and messages from this component, because those are really, really the core pieces. So, you know, the main thing that we've been saying is that you need to think about, you know, when you're starting your research even, to think about, at the end of the day, what can I possibly have happen as a result of this research? And we know for the DFID program, we're being marked specifically on 3 different kinds of, let's say, uptake. So we're looking for either policy changes or, you know, either new policies or changes to existing ones. We're looking for programmatic changes, so changes in the way that programs or interventions are done, or even just which ones are done. And then we're also looking for changes in strategic investments. So having, you know, whether it's donors or other groups put more money into FGMC work is another kind of goal we're looking at. So, you know, and these can happen in a number of different ways, but broadly, these are the kinds of end outcomes that we might be looking for when it comes to the uptake. So we really need to keep that in mind as we're going through, and not just sort of get to the point where we're at the end of the research and then say, oh, okay, well, what kind of change can we make? Because it's really important to think about it up front, because then you'll craft your research in a way that can answer the right questions and all of that kind of thing. So a key point is to really keep in mind your policy, your program, or your strategic investment goal. What is it that you want to happen at the end of this research? The other thing that those of you who did participate hopefully wouldn't have forgotten, because I say this constantly, is around the importance of identifying your audiences. And when we talked about audience, we did sort of break that up more specifically. You know, we're all very familiar with stakeholders and making sure stakeholders are involved and they know what's happening, and, you know, the gatekeepers and all that kind of thing. But we did specify that it's really important to think about who are the decision makers. So if we step back to the goal that we just talked about, whichever type of goal you are looking for, I want this policy change, or I want this organization to run their programs in this way, or we're looking for money from this foundation. If you think about those goals, then the next step is to think about, well, who is in charge of making that action happen, right? And so that's what you want to think about in terms of audience. So you're thinking about decision makers. When it comes to uptake, think about decision makers more so than even stakeholders broadly, because you're trying to target the people who can actually bring these goals to fruition. So when it comes to audiences, you have you're sort of segmenting them into 2 groups. Right, so your primary audience are those who can directly affect, here it says policy, but it can also be programs or strategic investments, who can directly affect those issues when it comes to your topic. So that's sort of the top decision makers. But of course we know that it's not always easy to just go straight to that, you know, person or that entity. Sometimes you have to kind of move up the chain and kind of work through different levels of influence. So you also want to be thinking about who's your secondary audience. And your secondary audience is basically those people who can influence that top decision maker. So that's also something to keep in mind when you're figuring out, okay, who am I trying to reach with this message? What am I asking them for? And, how do we ultimately get to that end goal? And then, like it says here in the second bullet, when it comes to secondary audiences, it's not just about, positive influence, but you also want to think about who might serve as a barrier. So there might be people who are in opposition to what you're saying, or they might be resistant to it. They might have their own, sort of political aims or personal aims, whatever it is. So you also want to think about that. Who might be an obstacle, and you would want to target them as your audience as well, because you basically want to get them on your side so that they're not, creating challenges or problems in you achieving the broader goal. So that's something important to think about as well. So then the next step we talked about is now how you would actually craft your messages. So you know what you want to achieve as your goal. You figured out who has the power to make those decisions and to make those actions come to life. And then now you're sort of thinking about how best to craft your messages for those people. And so we've basically talked about policy communication messages having three main parts. So they should be evidence-based, they should be contextualized, and action-oriented. And we talked about kind of these three parts that correspond to those things. So you've got your findings, right? This is basically just what comes out of your research. We found that this works, this doesn't work. We found this factor is associated with that one. Whatever your findings are telling you. Then it comes to the implications, which puts it in context. So yes, these are the findings, but why do these findings matter? What relevance do they have to this particular audience? Are they adding to the story? That type of thing. Oh, you're getting a feedback. And then finally, your policy communication message should have recommendations. So you want to be very clear about what you want them to do. So basically, the way I always talk about these three pieces is you're spelling out what's the problem or the issue that I'm wanting you to address. Why does this problem matter to you? Why should you care about this? And what do I want you to do about it? So if you just think about those three things, that can really kind of get you through the core of a policy message. So what's the problem, why you should care about it, and what you should do about it. So you can think about it that way. So the next three slides are just kind of give a little bit more information about what might go into each of those pieces of the message. So when it comes to findings, like we said, these are the results from your research. You really want to select the most important and the most relevant when it comes to the action that you're asking for. A lot of the research studies that we're doing are, they're very complex. They're asking multiple questions inside one study. It's very possible you're going to have a wealth of data, but it's not going to serve you well to try to present all of that to a particular decision maker, because it'll be a bit overwhelming, and it may not all support the particular action you're looking for. So you would want to kind of think about, what is that action and which are the specific pieces of data that support that. It may be that other parts of your data are useful to communicate to somebody else for a different purpose. So it's really important to think very carefully about that, because when you try to sort of overpack your message with data and information, then it kind of loses the sort of bang, and people kind of start to not sort of understand it very clearly. And then this is another key thing that we talked about during the workshop, is that your findings need to directly relate to your recommendations. So this is something that, when you're starting to craft these things, you can do it as a test for yourself. You sort of look at the recommendations you've come out with, and they need to really link back to findings, right? So if you suggest X intervention needs to be done, the findings really need to have shown that that was a gap, or something like that. Sometimes we come out with recommendations that sound reasonable, but then they don't actually match the type of findings that we're showing. So that's really important. And then, of course, with findings, we always emphasize translating it into very simple language. You know, sometimes we even forget what's not simple because we're so used to our research terms. You know, but you never want to be using the jargon, the odds ratios, and you know, even the significantly associated, things like that. You want to try to sort of pare down the language to make it more understandable to a layperson. So imagine that you're, you know, sort of talking to someone who is an intelligent person but is not a researcher. You know, how would you explain what you found and what the relationships are between the variables? Things like that. You know, maybe it's like, oh, it's more likely that this would happen, 2 times more likely. So you know, come up with different wording that's still accurate, but that doesn't have the technical jargon. So that is the key there. When it comes to implications, this is almost one of the hardest things that people find to do when they're crafting their messages, because it's the part that's often left out. With the implications, you're putting the data in context, you know, kind of taking it out of the vacuum and sort of saying, okay, this is why this matters. This matters because it's, you know, it's the first research of its kind, or it confirms, you know, what we know about this topic, or it matters because, you know, this shows us that there are some human rights implications, you know, of this kind of thing, and we've signed on to this human rights treaty, or, you know, it shows that it's unlikely that we're going to reach our, you know, sustainable development goals, or something like that. So when you're thinking about implications, you're answering the so what, right? Why does this matter, and why is it important for this decision maker you're talking to address? And so one of the key things we talked about here is also, this is where it comes in handy that you've done your research about this person or this entity. You know, what are they responsible for? What separate goals are they trying to achieve? What values do they have? What's their mission? All of those kinds of things, because then you can tie this in to say, you know, addressing this issue would contribute to you achieving your own national goal, or this and that. So it's really important to kind of do that homework and to put it in context. And then when it comes to recommendations, we want to be very specific about what it is we want to be done, whether that's an intervention or an action or a policy change, you know, if it's language, exactly what language needs to be changed where. And with your recommendations, to really also be clear about who needs to do it. You know, at the end of research papers, we do sometimes start hinting at things and sort of say, oh, you know, intervention should be done, you know, in this way or in a better way, or we should do some assessment of policies. But it kind of just throws it out into the empty space, like there's nobody assigned to do that thing. And so usually when we don't have an audience identified, things are not likely to get done. So you really want to be careful about specifying who you want to take your actions. And then, you know, you would support your recommendations with evidence. So again, tying back to the issue that your recommendations should link into what you had said were the gaps from your findings. And then I think you're all familiar with the SMART acronym in terms of making your recommendations smart. So what is that again? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So you definitely want to make sure, you know, that we don't leave it out in the air in terms of time either. So, you know, by the end of the year, you know, we should get this done, or, you know, even sometimes you're asking for small steps. It's not like you're going to go to a meeting and present and then ask for, you know, the $50 million, but it might be that your first ask is, you know, can we have a meeting next week with these 10 people to discuss this? You know, so when you think about your asks, you know, you want to think about that as well. You might put out there that yes, our larger goal is to have more strategic investment, but you know, we understand that there are steps that need to happen before that, so let's work through those steps. So just think about those things. And also being realistic, right? These are, you know, one study, and one study can't definitely, you know, make sort of big changes, but we want to make sure that we build on existing evidence and that kind of thing when we're suggesting large-scale changes. It's also possible we can ask for pilot interventions or smaller scale things that might be more feasible and realistic. So that's kind of the core of around crafting a message, right? Findings, implications, recommendations. And if you can grasp that, then you'll really have a good handle on what to do. So then we move into writing. And we would basically write using those same core principles. So, here we have the slide that says, we need to get on the same planet. We're sort of working in our research spheres, and, policymakers or programmers or donors, they work in their own spheres. And so, each of us have our own different incentive systems and things that motivate us and all of that type of thing. And so, that's why it can often be difficult for research uptake to happen, because there's, things are mismatched even in terms of timelines. So it's just really important for us to get on the same page and understand where others are coming from, what constraints they have, what timelines they have, and then think about how to fit things together. So when it comes to writing, the issue is just sort of making your research more accessible to policy audiences by, making it very clear and concise and, simple to understand. So when it comes to writing, one of the key things that we talked about is that you kind of shift your focus. We're all very used to an academic or a research writing style. And for policy writing, it's very different, and it takes a while to grasp the differences. They seem simple when you look at them, but when you actually try writing using those principles, it can be tricky. So obviously, some of the differences are that your audience is different, right? In this case, you're not just looking to inform other researchers what you did, you're actually looking to get some action from someone or from some organization. You have a very different writing style. It's not so academic, not so technical. You really want to pare it down. Your structure is different. Typically with policy writing, we say that the end comes first, meaning, you might even mention your recommendations right up front. So right up front, you tell them what this is all about. So we have these findings, this is why it matters, and this is what we think should be done. And you might say that immediately right up front in the first paragraph, and then you use the rest of your document to unpack those details. So you're not waiting for the end to now have a recommendation section and then say what should be done. Typically, you'll have a shorter length. Policymakers and these kind of people tend to be busy, and they're not going to sit through and read the long documents. So it wants to be longer. You want it to be shorter. And then the emphasis for these types of documents is a lot more on interpreting the meaning of the findings and suggesting the actions that you want to be taken. So we take a lot less focus on all the background literature review and the methods and all of that kind of thing. We do put them in there because we need to establish some credibility, but it's just less of a focus. It's a lot more focus on, what did we find, why do these matter, and what should be done. I think we've talked a lot about styles. I won't go into too much depth here, but you want to not be technical in your language, be a lot more conversational. So it's good practice. What you can do is just, read newspaper articles, read online articles that are about, professional topics, and then you start to get a sense of the style that works better in this kind of situation. You want to use subheadings to break up information inside your brief. You can imagine when somebody glances at it, if there's too much text, it just looks very dense and heavy, and it doesn't draw the reader in. Their eye doesn't go to any particular line or topic, and so they're sort of less likely to even read it. You want to spell out your acronyms, define all your terms, and it is very important with policy work to do citations. You don't want to oversight, but definitely if you're putting in key data points and things like that, you want to make sure that you have a citation there so that it's credible and people aren't questioning, well, where did you get that? That's not right. So that's definitely very important. So we did talk about just some rough guidelines in terms of a policy brief. So, you don't necessarily state your audience in your writing, but it's very much important for you to decide and think about who your audience is before you start writing. And it's very possible, sometimes we do write policy briefs that are just general. We're just writing this, it's going to be posted on the website, it's going out into the world. Basically, we just want people to know what happened. In that case, as long as you've decided that and you write that way, then that's fine. But I think for a lot of our cases, when it comes to research uptake, especially at the national levels, you might be writing things that are a bit more geared to a very specific audience, so that if you're going to have that meeting, with X stakeholder at the ministry or this and that, you might actually tailor your writing so that it speaks more directly to them, so that you would have your presentation, you would hand out this brief, and it really is just for them. It's not like a more generic one. So that's something to think about. Your length, roughly 4 pages, so just like, 2 pages front and back. And then there's a word guide here. Sometimes we have briefs that are longer, but I would say the shorter the better. And then, again, with your content, you're going to basically include not only implications and recommendations, but of course you'd put your findings in there as well. So that's a kind of the key structure when it comes to the brief. And this outline, it's very basic, but it works quite nicely for the policy briefs. So you want to have that first summary or overview paragraph, and I'll come back to that. Kind of a background section that just sort of lays the context for the issue in general, what's already known about it, what's been done, and then your key messages come into your findings. Then talk about the implications, why this matters, and then have a very specific recommendation section, and then kind of a conclusion that's sort of forward-looking and positive, sort of that implies if we are to take on these recommendations, we can achieve, X, Y, and Z positive things. So that's kind of the basic structure. And one of the things that we did talk about a lot during the workshop was the overview. And the overview is really important. It's basically, I sort of say it's just one paragraph that opens up your brief that actually gives the whole message. So in there, you would loosely give, your findings, why it matters, and your recommendation in more general language. So what I say is that you don't necessarily have to put all the data points into that piece. So if you find, so you're 80% or 90%, you wouldn't put that in, but you might just say, oh, we found that, the rates of HIV were particularly high in X community, and then the high will get explained in your findings section later by, putting your data in there. But you're trying to give a general idea. And even with your recommendations, you might not say in that first paragraph, it's recommended that we need, $50,000 for this, but you might say, additional investments are needed for this kind of intervention. But then later in your recommendations, you would be more detailed about what does that mean. So basically the idea is that your overview paragraph, if somebody only read that, they would get the whole message. They just might not have all the details there. So the idea is like generally give your message and then unpack it in the rest of your brief. Okay, so I jumped ahead of myself. So this is basically what we want to have in our overview. Since I already talked about it, I won't go over it again. And then this is just a reminder about the policy brief checklist that we gave out. And if anyone doesn't have it, we can definitely send it to you. So just let us know if you need that. But this is good. It's a good way to check your own briefs, right? We used it to critique an existing brief, but you can take, once you have a draft, you can kind of use this and just kind of go through the checklist and see if you've met these criteria. And I think this can be a really useful way of seeing whether you've crafted it well. So that is the reminder there. Basically, that's it. So that's the refresher for today. Hopefully that was helpful. And this is recorded, so we will be able to send this out to you and to other colleagues who haven't joined. And then I think now we'll just move into some questions, right? So Nicole will unmute you.
Right now, I don't have any questions. We're trying to, like, we've tried communicating with many NGOs so far after meeting at the ICAG meeting and the workshop, in order to inform them on the study and get a feel of how interested they are in like our initial idea was to bring together NGOs that work on FGM initiatives and campaigns to work together. And so there was a network for gender-based violence that brings together all the NGOs that work on FGM initiatives and others as well. So what I've tried to do is connect directly with these NGOs and try to get their interest in the topic in order to like start pushing further once we create like decide on the goal of the research uptake and the policy brief. We're still trying to figure this out, but I'm currently mapping the NGOs who are interested.
Okay, all right, that's good. So I wonder, I feel like Esther, the question you asked earlier and then the point that Widad raised are kind of connected to each other in a way. I think, Esther, you had raised the issue about, you know, how can the teams practically apply, you know, the kinds of, you know, whether it's theories or just sort of tips and things like that around, you know, how to do research uptake, like how are they actually going to apply these things? And I think, you know, it does connect to Widad's question because, you know, the reality of applying them is, you know, the decision maker engagement is a really important part of it. And if that requires, you know, travel or resources or multiple meetings and things like that, you know, how do we factor that in? Or, you know, if it's time that needs to be spent, you know, writing a policy brief or printing it and, you know, all of that kind of thing. So I don't know, Esther, if you have any thoughts on the resource side of things, and then if those on the research teams can maybe talk about constraints when it comes to time, or whether, you know, are you able to apply these things? How has it been going so far?
Yes, Reshma, and thank you for that presentation. I know this question came up at the partner meeting, and I think it will be a continuing dilemma in terms of resources. Yes, within the project, the resources for meetings and dissemination events are relatively limited, but I would never say that it is zero. So I think one of our communications, which we will do with the partners, is just to clarify that, you know, with key activities, there is a need to really consider what is the research uptake strategy, who are the decision makers, how do you intend to reach them, and to what end? Because this is an area that we are being measured against. And of course, we're not doing research for the sake of doing research. So I think it's more in terms of, you know, I think with that, what I would recommend is, you know, within your program work plan to include, you know, key strategic activities that make sense towards the broader goals of that study. And I think I'll give you an example. There are two studies that the FGMC partnership is doing on community interventions that have influenced abandonment of FGMC. One is in Somalia, one is in Kenya. And these are the studies that Richard Powell presented and Dennis Matanda presented.
Right.
And after looking at the studies more carefully, we are currently working on bringing together key decision makers around these issues, and really individuals who, implementing partners who are currently conducting interventions in Somalia and Kenya, as well as UNJP and UNICEF, to discuss the work that's being planned because we need their engagement, and then also to discuss the potential implications of it. And the initial discussion that we're planning, the initial strategy that we're considering, Reshma, we should probably have a side conversation on this to see, I'm sure there's much more that we could be doing more creatively, is putting together some briefs, some study briefs that really outline what the study is about and what questions, the key questions it's trying to answer and to what effect, and then having a very simple, small breakfast meeting. And we're bringing together the studies from both Kenya and Somalia to do this, to start to talk about the work. And then following that, communications with these individuals would likely be via email or by phone. The breakfast meeting is really intended to just set the foundation for future communications on that. We want to work with the health system strengthening team to do something similar. And then I think it's a different set of decision makers that are influencing the work is around the curriculum at the country level, and really trying to determine how do we engage with these decision makers on this issue. So I think with that to your question, yes, the funding is limited, but it's a key component of the research program's approach, and we need to figure out how to address it. So I know we have recently sent out a request for budget planning, and my recommendation would be to include that component in there. That the budget template does have a component for research uptake, and after you submit your work plan, you can follow up and discuss and really see what's feasible and what's not.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like, yeah. I mean, there's still more discussions that need to be had, but yeah. But I mean, I think that loosely that kind of idea can work with like you mentioned about the breakfast meeting, and then sort of setting stage for kind of continued conversations that might happen in a less resource-intensive way.
How can our partners go about determining what products they should be producing? Because I think that there is that recognition that not every study should have a policy brief, and some of the studies are relatively small. The data sample, not as robust, and really determining that maybe a policy brief may not be the right Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and we should.
And how to determine that?
It's a tricky one. It is a very good question, and I think we should, lean away from this idea that, oh, okay, we're going to do a policy brief for every study, because that seems to be the direction people go. Like, okay, now I get this. Let's do a policy brief. But I think the issue is, policy brief is relevant when, when I think you have enough information to sort of, kind of be asking for a reasonable type of change or action. So it might not be that it's coming all from your study, but maybe when you piece it together with other things, there's enough of a story or a picture to ask for what you're looking for. But if some of the studies are just, they're small, or we don't really know much, or something like that, then our purpose might just be more awareness raising. And, maybe in that case, it's, is it just kind of putting together a more user-friendly infographic that sort of is like, here's what was found in this new study, or like a one-pager fact sheet, or not fact sheet, but, like just a quick summary type of thing. So again, it goes back to your purpose. So is the purpose just about letting people know what was found? Is the purpose like, no, we're actually, asking for some fairly big things, and do I have enough evidence to support that kind of thing? So it goes back to that, and then it goes back to audience as well, like, who are we trying to reach and for what purpose? And so, it would be like kind of very individual cases to kind of look at them and say, okay, if this is the purpose and this is who we're reaching, what format makes the most sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it's very logical.
So yeah, I know it's like vague, but it's
No,
it's really the best way. You have to kind of sit down at the, when you're doing each one and kind of think that through and then decide accordingly.
No, I think that's really, that what you just said is really key, and taking the time to just take a step back and say, okay, what do we have, and these are our results, and then the so what, and who would they be most applicable to, and then how do we provide that information to them and to what end. So no,
right, because maybe in some cases it might just be you don't need the whole brief or anything. You just have your slide deck, so maybe you have your 10, 12 slides because you're planning on having a one-on-one meeting with them, or or a bigger meeting, so sometimes like that's your product, like that's enough, a set of policy slides, or or something shorter, or just an infographic that supplements that, or
No, thank you.
We are glad you joined us. And yeah, I think we'll just kind of bring this to a close for today. And yeah, just kind of keep a lookout for our emails. So we'll set up the next one, and then we'll also be setting up the country calls.